Okay. So dear friends and colleagues, thank you so much for joining us today for the 2021 edition of the District of Columbia Sociological Society Annual Awards Ceremony to celebrate the achievements and contributions of fellow sociologists in the area. I'm Yokushaw Taylor, DCSS President. We had hoped to have an in-person meeting, but we are gratified to have all of us together virtually at this time and in this virtual space. So DCSS continues to foster a community of local sociologists who are teachers, students, and practitioners. And for 87 years, we've dedicated ourselves to promote professional development in our local area. We are encouraged by the rigor of the research by our student awardees and inspired by the work of local sociologists who are making an impact on our world. So I'll say a little bit about the two awards. The Irene Taeuber Student Award is named in honor of a distinguished population researcher. Dr. Taeuber was a senior research demographer at the Office of Population Research of Princeton University and past president of the Population Association of America. She co-authored The Changing Population of the United States. She was editor of Population Index. She wrote and edited many influential books and articles on demography. She received her bachelor's degree from the University of Missouri, a master's from Northwestern University, and a PhD from the University of Minnesota. The Anna Julia Cooper Award for Public Sociology is named in honor of one of Washington, D.C.'s most distinguished sociologists, who was a scholar activist. Dr. Cooper was born into slavery, but went on to earn a bachelor's and master's degrees from Oberlin College, and later a PhD from the Sorbonne. Cooper's scholarship is most famously represented in her classic analysis of race and gender relations in post-Civil War America. A Voice from the South. Her book was published in 1891. She was a teacher, writer, founder of many organizations and a university dedicated to educating African Americans and women. So at this point, I wanted to say something short about two members that we lost this year. I wanted to say that this is remembrance for Mel Kohn and James Loewen. These Mel and Jim were longtime DCSS members, and we want to remember them for their many contributions to sociology and to our local society of sociologists. I think we are all better sociologists for their research and their work and their insights. And so I wanted to also to say that may their life and their memory be a blessing to all of us. So before we get into the awards, I wanted to say something about a service to DCSS recognitions. So today we also want to recognize the work of DCSS members. We recognize Stephen Tuck for many years of commitment to DCSS, for maintaining and managing our listserv for many years, and for his outreach efforts on behalf of DCSS. We recognize Sandy Hansen for many years of dedication and for organizing the DCSS Student Awards program each year. We also recognize Sally Hilsman for her dedication and devotion and significant contributions to the success of DCSS throughout the years. And finally, I wanted to recognize Julie Phipps Anderson. Julie was very instrumental in updating our communications platforms and did an outstanding job for DCSS. So with that, I wanted to pass it on to Kathy Gaudreau to do the student presentations.
Thank you, Yoku. Welcome, everyone. So in terms of the awards, the DC Sociological Society's Irene B. Taeuber Graduate Paper Committee received many good papers from area students this year. Thanks to all of the students who submitted. My colleagues Sandy Hansen, Roberto Patricio Krasinowic, and I worked together on the committee this year. And thank you very much to Sandy for leading this effort. The topics of the two winning papers could not be more current or timely. One addresses the Black Lives Matter movement, and the other focuses on healthcare workers and the COVID-19 virus. On behalf of the committee, I'm happy to announce the following two winners. The DCSS Graduate Paper Award Committee selected Simone Durham in the PhD program at University of Maryland, College Park as a recipient of the 2021 Irene B. Taeuber Graduate Student Award for a PhD paper. The title of Simone's paper was Not in This Lifetime, Black Millennial Reflections on Extant and Future Impacts of the Black Lives Matter Movement. Unfortunately, Simone could not be with us tonight, but I do want to provide a description. She uses concepts involving social movements, futures, and critical race theory to examine the intersection of race, possibility, and resistance. She collected qualitative interview data to answer her research questions and found some skepticism about the possibility of structural change. The Black millennials she interviewed did see more hope for cultural change involving race relations in the future. Simone's advisors at the University of Maryland are Dr. Dawn Dow and Dr. Rayshawn Ray. The DC Sociological Society Graduate Paper Award Committee selected Lan Huang in the MA program at George Washington University as the recipient of the 2021 Irene B. Taeuber Graduate Student Award for an MA paper. Lan is here with us tonight. The title of her paper is Female Health Workers in Wuhan, an Obscure Standpoint and Propaganda Tool. Lan applies intersectionality and neoliberalism frameworks to explore how female medical professionals in Wuhan, China were treated during the COVID-19 outbreak. Lan found evidence for considerable patriarchy, negative stereotypes, and limiting of rights in the treatment of the female health workers in Wuhan during the COVID-19 pandemic. China's adoption of neoliberal ideologies that were meant to help the economy but intensified oppression of Chinese women were discovered to be part of the explanation for this treatment. Lan's advisor at George Washington University is Dr. Ivy Ken. So please join me in congratulating both Simone Durham and Lan Huang as this year's Irene B. Taeuber Graduate Paper awardees. Thank you.
Lan, you're welcome to say a few words if you'd like.
Oh, hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm Lan from George Washington University Sociology Department. And I was actually very emotional when I wrote the paper because before everything or everyone in the US noticed that COVID is a thing, I already started to hear a lot of things that had happened in Wuhan and in China, like in other places. So at that time I was really nervous. Honestly, every day I just get up and check the news, what happened and everything. And so the female workers, the perspective is actually very ignored, very marginalized, or you can say obscure, because nobody could really help them, and they were treated with a lot of unequal treatment. So that's why I felt so emotional in writing that. And thank you everyone for reading my paper. And thank you.
So now Amaka Okechukwu would present the award for the Anna Julia Cooper Award for Public Sociology by a community organization.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to see folks, even though we're not in person. And I apologize, I'm having some connectivity issues, so I hope there's no interruption in this presentation. But today I'm presenting DCSS 2021 Anna Julia Cooper Award to the Center for Urban and Racial Equity, Pure partners with people and organizations to advance equity and justice through policy, systems, institutional, community, and societal change. They do this through research and analysis, strategic planning and consulting, and training and community engagement strategies that address systematic barriers to racial equity. Dr. Judith Lubin, CURE's founder and president, explained that the impulse for CURE began in part out of the desire to, quote, build a sociological practice, end quote, pointing to the ways that housing policy, for example, is one way in which people of color are contained, and more broadly, that these policies are an for structural racism. Operating out of this essential sociological vision of the interconnectedness of structures, the DCSS Executive Committee recognizes CURE's work in creating and curating tools that build knowledge, analysis, and skills to practice racial equity and work toward a vision for racial justice, and city briefs that highlight the impact of structural racism and efforts of activists, grassroots organizations, and city government to build equitable and just communities in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York City, New Orleans, Miami, St. Louis, and San Francisco. So congratulations to CURE and Dr. Judith Lubin, who I believe is accepting the award on CURE's behalf.
Good evening,
Judith, I don't know if you have any words for us.
I do. Thank you so much, Amaka, and thank you so much to the executive committee and to DCSS for this honor. It was quite a surprise to receive your email notifying us that we were selected for the Anna Julia Cooper Public Sociology Award. And I accept this award on behalf of the entire CURE team. And I want to say we accept this award at a really profound moment in DC's history and in this nation history, where we're going through a racial reckoning that was spurred by the movement for Black lives that has really pushed organizations and institutions to begin to confront their role in creating and maintaining racial inequities across American society. Because of the grassroots movements and activism that we're seeing on the street, that has opened up an incredible amount of space for the work that CURE does, which is really to make racial equity real, not just in principle, but in organizations and institutions that affect all facets of our lives. We believe that in order to build just communities and a just society, we have to build just and humane institutions. The work of anti-racism is really of the work of rebuilding, right, and restructuring society. And we know as sociologists that our society is largely comprised of different institutions. And so we have to build those institutions really from the ground up so that they're centering equity, right, and undoing the work in which they have been built, which is to center inequality and exclusion. And so to that end at CURE, we're really trying to build, as Amaka said, an urban sociological practice, applying tools like research. We do focus groups and interviews, surveys almost every other day, right, assessing how organizations are performing, what is their current state of racial equity, what are their existing practices, and we apply our critical lens. We use frameworks like critical race theory, we use intersectionality and other critical analysis tools to really push organizations, institutions, and leaders to look at their decision-making practices, look at whose voices that they're honoring, whose voices are not being included in decision-making processes, and what are the implications for Black and Brown communities. We literally oftentimes are taking them through a short course in sociology, training organizational leaders on institutional and structural racism. What does it look like within your own organization? Oftentimes for the first time, they're really having a conversation about systemic inequalities and how their practices may have contributed to perpetuating injustices in Black and Brown communities. One specific example here that we're working on locally is with the DC Office of Planning. And so we're providing training around what structural racism is, the history of displacement and gentrification in DC. And we're providing real-time evaluation and feedback on small area neighborhood plans that the Office of Planning is currently conducting for Chevy Chase in Congress Heights and on Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast. So there is real momentum that is happening, and it's encouraging to see that government agencies and other institutions are really pausing and looking at their practices and wanting to bring the insights of sociology into their work, recognizing the long history of structural racism, but recognizing that they have a role to play in undoing, right? And that they have a role in building racial equity within our communities and in collaboration with residents and communities. So I just want to say that, I mean, it is truly an honor to accept a Public Sociology Award named after Anna Julia Cooper. At CURE, we really believe, just as Anna Julia Cooper believed, that the work of remaking society is about truth telling, telling hard truths and uncomfortable truths that push people to action. We use sociological tools, as I mentioned, to do that. And that work and the change process is often hard, it's messy, it requires emotional labor, and it's often unseen work of working side by side with organizations and leaders to change their practices. And so a good deal of this work is hands-on, building up this capacity. And so thank you so much for recognizing the structural racism city profiles, our COVID-19 equitable response hub, our racial justice scorecard, and other activities and tools that we're sharing with the community to help amplify community-driven solutions to address inequities and injustices. And then I'll lastly add that I am a woman of the South, right? As Anna Julia Cooper talked and made us really aware of the voices and the unique experiences of women of the South, but particularly of Black women, and lifting up the intersectional analysis and unique experiences that Black women not only have as a result of our experiences of race and class and gender oppression, but Anna Julia Cooper believes strongly in the agency of Black women and Black women to lead transformation of society. And so that is my own personal journey in learning when and where I enter. To quote Anna Julia Cooper again, when and where I enter in the field of sociology, I am very much grounded in the ideas of public sociology and scholar activism. And our work at CURE is really to bring this intersectional lens. We often say we lead with race, but we can't talk about race without talking about gender, without talking about class, without talking about sexuality, and the other ways, and the ways that other forms of oppression intersect to create profound differences and outcomes. So again, thank you so much to DCSS for this honor, for recognizing the work of CURE and for uplifting and celebrating public sociology. Thank you. Thank you, awesome. We look forward to, to receiving it in hand, Dr. Taeuber, Shaw Taylor.
Thank you so much. So with that, I will now introduce Dr. Robby Jones, who is our speaker for tonight. Dr. Robby Jones has to step away for a few minutes around 6:15 for childcare issues, but he's going to be back. But let me start with an introduction. Our speaker for this evening, Dr. Robert P. Jones, is CEO and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI. He's a scholar and a commentator on religion, culture, and politics. He's the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, and The End of White Christian America, which won the 2019 Grawemeyer Award in Religion. Dr. Jones writes regularly on politics, culture, and religion for The Atlantic Online, NBC Think, and other outlets. He has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and his work has appeared in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Dr. Jones serves on the National Program Committee for the American Academy of Religion and is a past member of the editorial boards for the Journal of American Academy of Religion and Politics and Religion, a journal of the American Political Science Association. Dr. Jones holds a PhD in religion from Emory University and a master's in divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and a bachelor in science in computer science and mathematics from Mississippi College. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Jones.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm thrilled to be here with you all, and so inspiring hearing student papers, community activism, and all the vibrant work that's going on. I think what I'll talk about tonight is very much in that vein of socially engaged scholarship. So before I jump in, just I may in fact have to kind of hit pause here in 20 minutes. I'm juggling an 11-week-old puppy and an 11-year-old son who are sort of coming in and out and kind of solo parenting tonight. So if that happens, I'll do a quick pause, but I don't think it'll be a long one, just to kind of get everyone settled, and then we'll be back up and at it. But I'll start with just a little bit about myself. I'm going to talk about the book and White Too Long, and particularly the sociological research, public opinion research in the book. But before I do, I'll tell you a little bit about myself and kind of locate myself. So as you heard, my day job, I'm the CEO and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, here in DC. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization dedicated to research at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. We do somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 interviews with Americans every year, and about a dozen public opinion surveys each year, depending on a little more in election years. And our primary really audience is journalists. It's primarily foundation funded. About 90% of our foundation, our funding comes from private foundations. But the book is kind of a combination of the work that we do there. We focus our work at PRI around a whole range of topics, but 4 areas in particular. One of them is pluralism and a pluralistic democracy. Second one is racial justice issues. Third one is immigration issues, and the fourth one is LGBTQ rights. And the book kind of pulls really largely from the racial justice work that we've been doing for some time. But this book is also, I should say, as some of the work I've already heard, here tonight from others, somewhat personal. And it is, in fact, the first time I've written in the first person, which I had to kind of teach myself to do a little bit. I know in graduate school, many of you, like me, got kind of that beaten out of us, right? This kind of objectivity where you write in the third person and all of that, even if the project is very much personal, right, to you. So this is the first book that I've written actually in the first person. The first sentence in the book has the word I in it. The last sentence in the book has the word us in it. And I'm locating myself as someone who grew up white and Christian in the South, and as a Southern Baptist in Jackson, Mississippi. And so part of what the book is doing really is trying to turn a sociological and social scientific lens on really part of my own experience of growing up in this world, and to try to understand what the history tells us, but not only what the history tells us, but what this means for how things like attitudes on racism, particularly systemic racism, are still with us today, and how they're tied to particularly white Christian identity. So I'm going to kind of lay out some of the work that is there in the book. I'll start though with a quote that is from where the title comes from, so that that doesn't sort of linger out there and be in the blue. And let me just share my screen here, where I can walk you through a few pieces of data as we go. All right. All right, so let me start with this quote from James Baldwin. So this is a quote, I did a lot of background research, and this is a quote that really stayed with me as I was kind of working on the book, and one that frankly just was kind of an indictment that I had a hard time letting go of. So this is a quote from a New York Times op-ed that James Baldwin wrote in 1969, just a few months after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So he's writing at a time where he was, I think, hoping all along during the civil rights movement that great numbers of white Americans, and particularly white Christians, would stand up and be counted as part of the civil rights movement, which never happened. And in particular, in the wake of King being gunned down, also there was not this kind of uprising really of white Christian people as well. And here I'm going to read the full. This is part of the statement. I'm going to read the full statement. It says this: I will flatly say that the bulk of this country's white population impresses me, and has so impressed me for a very long time, as being beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may so put it, too long. They have been married to the lie of white supremacy too long. The effect on their personalities, their lives, their grasp of reality has been as devastating as the lava which so memorably immobilized the citizens of Pompeii. They are unable to conceive that their version of reality, which they want me to accept, is an insult to my history and a parody of theirs, and an intolerable violation of myself. So, this quote really stayed with me as I was doing the research. And really what I'm up to, I think, is trying to figure out what role whiteness and white supremacy have played in Christian identity over time, in our history, and in the present. So that's really what the work is really about. In that it is really what trying to sort out what Eddie Glaude, it's a good friend of mine, just wrote a great book actually on James Baldwin called Begin Again, calls white supremacy without all the bluster, right? Not this kind of grainy black and white image of people in robes burning crosses, but things that are much closer to home, zoning laws, mass incarceration, all of these kinds of things, police, differential policing between how police handle white and black protesters, things that are right out of the news, killing of African Americans by police in disproportionate numbers. These are the things I'm trying to get at in the book, and what people's attitudes are around those issues of kind of bringing systemic race, kind of a lens on systemic racism and white supremacy much closer to home. I also want to just kind of say a little bit more about this being a personal story. So I told you I grew up Southern Baptist. My family goes back 6 generations into Middle Georgia and in and around Macon, Georgia, actually on both sides. I'm actually the first generation not to live in Macon, Georgia in over 200 years. And as I was doing some genealogical research, I came across an early inventory as one of my ancestors died, and came across this, and it's a listing of all their kind of earthly possessions at the end of the thing, and listed along with cows and beds and ovens are enslaved people here. And I've kind of written out the thing here, and I sort of knew basically that somewhere back there that our family had enslaved other people, but it wasn't until I saw this document that it really came home here. And if you add all this up, this is kind of notable that my family was not the kind of gone with the wind, massive plantation owners. They owned about 200 acres of land. This particular family did, but all of their possessions added up. The money they had tied up in owning other human beings was about 70% of their earthly possessions, and they were essentially a kind of lower middle class to working class family. It was a subsistence farm, but even at that level, enslaving other people was a way of making their lives work. And also throughout my family tree are Baptist pastors, preachers, a few Methodists thrown in, Confederate soldiers. So it was partly out of this mix of knowing from whence I come, right? My people, and this juxtaposition of holding together Christian beliefs and enslaving other people, and not seeing the incompatibility of those things that really, I think, pushed me to do this work. A couple of things just here about the history before I dive into some numbers is, I think the history has been fairly well hidden, even though it's just barely under the surface. And if you hear the words civil rights and church, what most people think about or immediately comes to mind, are African American churches that served as hubs of organizing for the civil rights movement. What they don't think about very often, and certainly most white Christians don't think about, are the role that white Christian churches played in massive resistance to civil rights. Is fairly well documented, even though it's not something that well known. Case in point, I talk about in the book. I was the kid who was at church all the time growing up, and it wasn't until I was 20 and in seminary, so in graduate school, that I learned about the origins of my own denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, and that word Southern in the name, which is still there today, was not just a geographic designator, but it was in fact a marker for it actually predated the Civil War, but it was a marker for a kind of Southern way of life that included enslaving other people. So my denomination was founded actually in 1845 as a place for making the enslavement of other people consistent with the gospel. And that is literally the reason why the denomination was founded. And that this denomination isn't any fringe denomination. Some of you may know who may study this, but by the mid 20th century, the Southern Baptist Convention becomes the largest Protestant denomination of any kind in the country. So the predominant expression of white Protestant Christianity is one that was explicitly founded to justify and really baptize enslaving other people. So that was kind of a shock to the system for me, even in seminary. And it really has been a journey of kind of coming to terms with that. Just to say, mark this well, though, it's not just, I think, white evangelicals, that kind of group of churches in the South, but it's really all branches of white Christianity that share this history. There's virtually no major denominations that were in existence at the time that did not split over the issue of slavery. The Methodists split in the same year in 1845, who at the time were the largest predominantly white denomination, into the Methodist Episcopal Church South and North. And the Catholic Church did not split, but it's kind of remarkable if you look at the history there. So I'm, here in Maryland, for example, there was a Catholic census that was done in the late 1700s, and Bishop Carroll writes that about 1/5 of those who were counted as Catholic were enslaved people owned by either white Catholic individuals or white Catholic institutions. And we know Georgetown, for example, has been reckoning with its own Jesuit institution, its own history here. And none other than W.B. Du Bois, when commenting on the Catholic Church's role, had this to say: the Catholic Church in America stands for color separation and discrimination to a degree equaled by no other church in America, and that is saying a great deal. So this ran through really all of the major white Christian groups. And, in these, kind of one of the things that became clear of studying the history is that in these seedbeds of American Christianity, there was just a presumption of white supremacy, and that shaped what could be practiced. So, for example, an enslaver can't share a common cup of Christian fellowship with someone who's enslaved. It shaped what was preached, very light on themes like Exodus and liberation, very heavy on themes from the New Testament on obedience. And it influenced how Christians came to embody and understand their faith generation after generation. So if that history is there, what does this look like today? And I'll note one quick book here that I think is worth a shout out, a book called Deep Roots, that was done by some political scientists at Berkeley. But it was a really amazing study that found that they could actually correlate, even with a bunch of controls in place, levels of slaveholding in the 1860 census with the attitudes of white Americans today, all the way down to the county level. Like the findings were actually sensitive. They used the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, and the findings were sensitive all the way down to the county level. So even, for example, you could look at two counties in Arkansas, one that had higher levels of enslaved people, one that had lower levels, and today you can see those effects, even with controlling for education and all kinds of other things among white residents. But what I want to do is to take a look and see what the role of Christianity was among white Americans relative to their attitudes on race, and particularly systemic racism. So what I tapped some survey work that PRI did in 2018. The book came out in 2020. It was written in 2019. So the data is from 2018 here. I have a couple of slides where I've updated some of the numbers, but most of the data is from 2018. These are large samples of 2,500 Americans and random probability samples from PRI. And here's just one example. On the left, you'll notice I've broken out three major groups of white Christians: white evangelicals, that group that's largely predominant in the South; white mainline Protestants, the group that's predominant in the upper Midwest and the Northeast; and then white Catholics, which are a more urban constituency and also kind of more prominent in the Northeast; and then whites who are religiously unaffiliated. And the reason I broke that out is that I, again, wanted to see what work, or try to isolate what work Christian identity was doing among white non-Hispanic Americans. And then I have African-American Protestants here just as a reference group on the bottom. But this pattern that you see on this question, so this is a question, percent who disagree with the statement: generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for Blacks to work their way out of the lower class. So you may recognize this from GSS. But what we found is that 2/3 of white evangelicals disagree, but so do more than 6 in 10 white mainline Protestants. And this group is often seen as the more liberal end of the white Protestant world. And a solid majority of white Catholics agree with the statement. It drops down to about 4 in 10 whites who are religiously unaffiliated. But this pattern of white Christians of all kinds kind of clustering together, white evangelicals looking a little more extreme, but white mainline Protestants and white Catholics being not far behind, and there being like 25 to 30 points of difference between white Christian views and whites who are religiously unaffiliated, holds up across a whole range of questions. I'll show you just a couple more. Perceptions of Confederate symbols and flags, or flags and monuments. Here you see very similar patterns. I won't kind of hit them all, but really you can just see the pattern. White Christians much more likely to say that these the flags and monuments are more a symbol of Southern pride rather than a symbol of racism. White religiously unaffiliated Americans largely disagreeing with that view, and being, again, 20 to 30 points different on those questions. One more that is certainly been in the headlines over the last year, really over the last 5 years, is whether the question, whether the killing of unarmed African Americans by police are isolated incidents, or whether they're part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans. These are the percentage of people who say they are isolated incidents. White evangelicals, again, 7 in 10. White mainline Protestants and white Catholics, still a majority, nearly 6 in 10, saying these are isolated incidents. One quick subnote here is that our footnote is that the views of white mainline Protestants and white Catholics were actually indistinguishable from white evangelicals in 2015. But since 2015, and really tracking the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, these views have dropped by about 12 percentage points since then. There's still a majority territory. The pattern still holds, but there has been some daylight that has shown up between white evangelicals on the other hand and other white Christian groups on the other. Again, here are whites who are religiously unaffiliated, way down at 1/3. So finally, what I did in the book is I used 15 different questions to kind of get a sense of white Americans and white Christians' attitudes on issues of race, racism, and systemic racism. These 15 questions actually correlated quite highly together. The Cronbach's alpha is like 0.9 on these questions, so they're highly correlated. These are the median scores. If I kind of standardize the index, I use those 15 questions, put them together in an index, and standardize the scores 0 to 1. And what you basically see here is that while those there is some daylight, but white Christian groups look remarkably similar to one another, despite their different theological backgrounds, geographic dispersion, and even historical development. White evangelical Protestants score about 0.8, like 0.78, and then White mainland Protestants and white Catholics score down around 0.7, but their median scores. But white religiously unaffiliated Americans are down around 0.4. So again, that's the overall pattern that showed up question after question after question. So that's the correlation. The real question is, well, is this, of course, caused by something else or not? So, I use a regression model to try to see if I could sort out the individual effects. So controlled for party, education, region, urban versus rural, gender, age, et cetera, all the kinds of things I could think of that would be, covariates or explaining this relationship away. These are the predicted probabilities of the increase as you move from least racist to most racist on the racism index. As you move that from that kind of dial from 0 to 1, and even with controls in place, what you basically see is that as you move from the least racist to the most racist on the racism index, that each of these white Christian subgroups, it makes you about 20 percentage points more likely to identify as one of these white Christian groups. Again, as you move that from 0 to 1, and what's notable is that the effect is actually in the opposite direction among whites who are religiously unaffiliated. So in other words, this is an independent Christianity. This is highly suggestive that Christianity is doing a significant part of the lifting here. That this kind of, there's a direct connection between scoring more highly on the racism index and identifying as one or more of these groups of white Christians. The other thing that I wanted to check here too is whether or not church attendance made any difference. Because one objection, of course, could be that, well, these are maybe people who just claim to be Christian. Our surveys ask people to self-identify, but maybe they're not actually connected in any way to churches or going to Bible study or worship services, et cetera. So I took a look at church attendance and to see if that had any mitigating effect. I think as many white Christians might think it would. And what I found was that overall, that there was actually no mitigating effect of church attendance. That is, the relationship between holding more racist attitudes and identifying as a white Christian were just as strong among white Christians as a whole, among those who attended more frequently and those who attended less frequently. However, when I looked down at the individual subgroups, this popped out, and that is that white evangelicals, church attendance does make a difference, but not in the direction I think many white Christians might suppose. And that is that the relationship between holding more racist views and identifying as a white evangelical Protestant is actually stronger among frequent church attenders than it is among infrequent church attenders. In fact, it's about 4 times as strong among frequent church attenders than infrequent church attenders. And I think if you take the history seriously in the country, this, I think, which may be shocking to some, becomes, much more understandable. And one person I talked to put it is like, well, if you don't really think too hard about the history, you don't know the history, you look at this and you think, well, how can that possibly be? But I think with the history in place, it kind of gets transformed to, well, how could it be otherwise? Really, given the history. Here, I'll show you a couple of other slides just to kind of update. That's from the book. But one other thing that just kind of, speaking of history, voting patterns, many of you may be familiar with this, but with one exception, it is notable that really since Reagan, the voting patterns of white Christians have typically aligned with the Republican Party. And that really is the result. I think the best reading of this is historically is it is the result of a great white flight from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party in the wake of civil rights. So once the Democratic Party becomes the party of civil rights after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in the mid-1960s, there really is this attrition and flight of white Southerners, white Christians from being Democrats, where they were for a generation or two, following the Civil War, to being Republican, and they get solidified by Republican. And that pattern has pretty much been there and is still with us today, as you can see here. And here are basically every other religious group we can break out from the exit polls. This is the Associated Press, Fox Votecast exit poll here. And it's also notable that there are no two groups in the country that have diametrically more opposed voting patterns, than white evangelical Protestants on the one hand and African American Protestants on the other, despite the fact that they share a lot in terms of history and actually religious beliefs. But this pattern is really quite striking. And I'm just going to put up here that same pattern. These are the same numbers from the previous slide, but juxtapose the racism index scores from the book, standardized 0 to 100 here. And you actually see they line up pretty well. They're not perfect, but scores, higher scores on the racism index correlate fairly highly with support for Trump. And you could go back for Republican presidential candidates in general, going back. And then there's this that many people missed, I think, in the exit polls, but there's some real evidence that racial attitudes or attitudes about race, and particularly attitudes about systemic racism, are becoming some of our biggest political divides, and in fact are actually bigger than the divides over marriage equality, divides over abortion, for example. So this is from the NEP exit poll. If you had an unfavorable opinion of Black Lives Matter, that group voted 85% for Trump. Similarly, if you thought the U.S. criminal justice system treats all people fairly, that group voted 83% for Trump. And if you thought racism in the U.S. was either a minor problem or no problem at all, you voted 82% for Trump. And if you, just to kind of make this, I didn't put this on the slide, but abortion was also in the exit poll, and the divide there was if you thought abortion should be illegal in all or most cases, you voted 75%. Those respondents voted 75% for Trump. So these attitudes over systemic racism are actually a stronger divider of the country today than even attitudes over abortion that we think of as being such a big divider. I'm going to close, since we're a sociologist here, with an experiment that we did in last year's American Values Survey that PRI does every year with Brookings. But I think it puts a fine point on this, on white Christians and the way that systemic racism is still imbued and white supremacy is still kind of part of the DNA of white Christian theology and belief and identity today. So we did a little experiment. We split our sample into two identical components, and we had two different versions of the question. One that just said it makes our country better when Americans speak up and protest unfair treatment by the government. And the second version of the question that only half the sample got was, it always makes our country better when Black Americans speak up and protest unfair treatment by the government. As you can see here, there was a nearly 10 percentage point drop in the percentage of Americans who agreed when the referent was Black Americans versus just Americans. And you won't be surprised to know that drop is bigger among white Americans than it is among the public as a whole. But just to kind of show you, these same patterns show up. White evangelicals, white Catholics, white mainline Protestants, all showing 12 to 20 point gap. Among white evangelicals, a 20 point drop off in the proportion of white evangelicals who say it makes our country better when Black Americans speak up and protest unfair treatment. And if you look at the numbers of white unaffiliated, there's a little bit of drop off, but it is barely outside the margin of error for that subgroup in this survey. So it's almost indistinguishable there. So this is very much still with us today. So with that, let me just kind of close here, say this. So while it may seem obvious today, one of the conclusions that I kind of came to in the book is, while it may seem obvious to white Christians today, to many of them, that slavery, segregation, and overt declarations of white supremacy are antithetical to the teachings of Jesus, what the record really shows is that such a conviction is in fact recent and only partially conscious for most white Christians, both Protestant and Catholic. And that really the unsettling truth is that for nearly all of American history, the light-skinned Jesus conjured by most white congregations was not merely indifferent to the status quo of racial inequality, but he demanded its defense and preservation as part of the natural divinely ordained order of things. Today, the country is once again facing a racial reckoning, and the question of racial justice is ever before us, and the question is being called. And all across America, a great cloud of witnesses is gathering to see whether, and I'm gonna speak inclusively here, put myself, as I said, I end the book, in the kind of first person, whether we white Christians can find the humility and courage and love to face the truth about our long relationship with white supremacy. We're seeing monuments to white supremacy falling in cities across the country. The question is whether white Christians will take the lead in dismantling the white supremacist worldview that we legitimized to erect them in the first place. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Robby Jones. This is great. Shall we entertain questions now, or would you like to take a break and come back? How do you want to do this? Do you still want to step away?
So far I'm good.
Okay.
I'm just waiting for my son to show up, but I
Okay.
made it through before he got here.
Great. Thank you so much for that. So I have one quick question for you. How about non-Christian whites? Did you do any comparisons to non-Christian whites who I guess might be Muslim, Jewish, or what other religious category? But do you have any findings from doing with those comparisons?
Yeah, well, there were some in those last slides I showed from the exit poll. So American Jews, for example, who are predominantly white, tend to score lower on the racism index, tend to vote overwhelmingly Democratic, for example, tend to be able to see systemic racism on individual questions higher than other groups. We didn't have enough to break out other religions than that. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church, scores pretty consistently with white evangelicals in the surveys that we've been able to break out for them.
Thank you. More questions? Anyone has questions for Robby?
I had seen a Pew research survey, and I'm not going to be able to give the data as precisely as I would like, but what it seemed to show, this was in the wake of the protests following George Floyd, was a change in what looked at first like a change in white attitudes toward questions about whether race was an important issue that had to be dealt with, was the general. But when you broke it out, it turned out that it was that the change that was there was among Democratic voters, that there had been no change among Republicans, but Democrats had made a fairly, and it appeared to be white, obviously it would be white Democrats, had made a significant shift. At the time I clung to it as a little piece of good news. And I guess I just I know I've given that badly, but can you make some comment on my garbled account there?
Yeah, so a lot of the polarization that we're seeing are actually, they're driven by party and education. So you're right that what we're seeing movement, and we've seen significant movement among white Democrats. We see it on that question of the killing of African Americans by police. White Democrats are much more likely today to see these as part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans than they were 5 years ago. So you do see this kind of partisan movement, and you're right. We've actually had a headline that said, the Black Lives Matter movement has moved the country on that question. Actually, the general population numbers moved, but the groups that have not moved at all are Republicans and white evangelical Protestants, who are still around 70%, saying that no, these are just isolated incidents that have nothing to do with one another.
And with our current system of government right now, with gerrymandering still in place and with the Electoral College still operating, then this group that you're targeting are exercising, am I right, an impact on American government out of all proportion to their actual numbers. And there's no end in sight for that.
That's right, and it's truer at the state level, state and local level,
Yeah.
even than it is at the national level. But either way, to give you an example, so white evangelical Protestants in 2020 have actually been dropping as a proportion of the population. They're aging, their age is going up, their numbers are going down because they're losing young people over the past decade. And so, you know, back in 2006, for example, they were 23% of the country. Today, they're 14.5% of the country in our latest numbers from 2020. But they turn out to vote at higher levels relative to other Americans. So, for example, they were 14.5% of the country, but they were about 20% of voters because of higher turnout. And you add to that gerrymandering at the local level, and you've got, you know, even more. It's exactly right, of a kind of disproportionate. So even in a place like Texas, for example, white evangelicals only make up 17% of Texans. But you wouldn't know that if you looked at the legislature, you know, the people who are actually in the legislature. Yeah.
17. Well, then I'm looking for an area of agreement with them. And I'm just wondering how many of them feel it's time that we think about secession and separation.
Yeah, you know, some of the more disturbing stats, I just wrote about this last week at a piece for Time magazine called "The Unmaking of the White Christian Worldview," and it you know, 1 in 3. So what's happening, I think, is as this group is shrinking, it's and the sense that the clock is ticking, right? As their population is shrinking, they are becoming, and you know, this again, these are my people, you know, but they're becoming more desperate. So, for example, our last study in August showed 1 in 4 of them are QAnon conspiracy believers. 1 in 3 say that they think that true American patriots agree with the statement that true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country. 1 in 3, right? So it's a troubling place. I think we're in.
Yeah, unless we begin possibly to have civilized conversations about how we might separate. That is, that I think there's a tendency to equate separation with violence, but there may be other solutions. And I think the attention that needs to be paid to climate change and other issues really, for me, pushes us. We can't go on, and I feel in the paralysis and deadlock that we're in.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'll say about secession, you know, someone who grew up in the South, is take Mississippi. I think my son may be showing up. You hear my dog barking. But take Mississippi, right, my home state. You know, it's one of the highest populations of African Americans of any state. Right. So if Mississippi secedes,
Yeah.
you know, there's a huge African American population that's going to be stranded. Right. I think people often forget that, you know, states in the South, you know, think about the African American populations, right? They're not just in big cities, right? They're in rural areas in the South.
No, I'm not saying that this would be easy and and we can just abandon people, but I increasingly think if we don't have some conversation about it, we're looking at absolute disaster by 2024.
Very lively conversation. So we can entertain a few more questions, but Jill, I also wanted to say that this would be a good opportunity for you to say something about the Sociologist. Jill is the editor of the Sociologist, and the new issue is coming up. So you could say something about that. I also want to thank again Robby Jones for agreeing to be our speaker and being flexible enough to work with us with all the changes and formats and all of that. And thank you so much, Robby. I really appreciate your time with us. And so, Jill, did you want to say something about the sociologist now?
Well, quoting the words of my distinguished co-editor, Patrick Healy, we have done it. It is now in print, and it is coming hopefully to a website near you soon. It has been quite an adventure taking over from the very, very successful team of Bree Bokratsky and Yoku Shaw Taylor, who had been overseeing this. We've had wonderful support from George Mason University, and we're hoping to reach out to more universities. Patrick Healy, who has been co-editing with me, has just been a rock of Gibraltar. He is a splendid editor. We could not have the magazine in better hands. We also were very fortunate in recruiting Journey Lauder, who is a junior at George Washington University, and she moved in and helped us with much of the layout and design. We're excited about getting the issue online so that you'll have a chance to see it, because we have two beautiful photo essays that are sort of retrospectives on what happened here in DC in December and January. And I think you'll enjoy those. We have the talk from Cecilia Menador, the new ASA president, and a response by a graduate student in our service area to that. And we have a very good piece, an interview with Evan Douglas, who's a graduate student in criminology. And Evan has been a DC policeman and is now working with another number of organizations on police reform. So and then we have a very nice series of memories of Mel Kohn, John Curtis, and Joanna Bachman, and Sandra Hansen gave us just, and that makes I think a special part of the issue for those of us who knew Mel. So it's been a good piece of work. We also have, in connection with Evan Douglas's presentation, we have a report on Howard University's panel series last year on conversations about race and racism and police reform. Evan appeared as a panelist at one of those, and that's what sort of gave us the idea of getting an interview with Evan. Journey Lauder, who has also done our design, has written a really splendid think piece on the Capitol Hill police officers who committed suicide after the insurrection on January 6th. And the very sad thing about that story is it continues to be relevant. At the time that Journey was writing it, we had two Capitol police officers commit suicide, and I think that we now have a total of five, who have killed themselves in the aftermath of that. And it seems to me that again speaks to the talk by Robby Jones today in terms of the deep divisions in the country and where we go from here. The other nice thing about the Howard University retrospective that's given us by a Howard University student, Sally Lamaka, is Judy Lubin, our winner of the Anna Judy Cooper Award, spoke there. And that's when several of us had a chance to see her and become aware of her organization for the first time. So I think the issue also reflects the ways that the District of Columbia Sociological Society does help bring people together in the district, and that as we go forward, and Patrick and I have been working together now for a while, but this is our first birth, and it's been an exciting time. And I think we're thinking a lot about ways that we can use the sociologists to make us increasingly a voice for all the schools in DC, as well as all the people who are employed in various ways, who are sociologists, but sometimes because we have been primarily a teaching profession, we don't pick up on those people as much as we might. So we go forward with high hopes. I don't know if Journey was able to make it tonight, Patrick, would you? I don't know. Are you in a point where you can go visual? Yeah. Really, if you would join me in giving a big hand to Patrick, I cannot tell you, he is such a wonderful person to work with, that is the luck of the year, is getting Patrick from George Mason and Journey Lauder from GW, and that we are now bringing an editorial staff that is the coming generation rather than the exiting generation. I hope I will increasingly fade into the background and be the connection to DCSS when needed. But you really watch the young people taking over. I'm sorry, we have had just a mess of computer problems tonight. And I do not have with me the available for you to see our contributor page. But I think our contributor page, when the issue is online, which I hope will be fairly soon, our contributor page really will make you feel good, because we have so many young people contributing and suggesting oh great, Patrick. That's wonderful. Yes, thank you. Okay, that's just great. And you get a good look. That's Journey, and Ryan Lowe is one of our photographers with Wen Guan, his significant other. Noah Samel did the interview with Evan Douglas. Connor Barbary did a nice piece on how students, that is, felt about the virtual learning experience. And it started off in sort of one direction, and then under Connor's very successful interviewing, it became a nice portrait of people and their families. That is college students and their families during the long haul of virtual learning. Sally Amaka was one of the people who helped organize the Howard University series. And Lauren Diaz Quintana is a graduate student at George Washington University. And she's doing work and has done and wants to continue to do work helping undocumented immigrants. And so she was able to write a nice reply based on her experience to Cecilia Menevar's very fine presidential address. So I think it's an issue that is nicely represented. Oh, and here's Patrick, can you show the cover?
Oh, certainly, yeah. I went to the table of contents, but here is the cover.
Yeah, and that, of course, was taken during the period of the insurrection. So it seemed to us it caught what this last year has been like.
And
Patrick, you have anything else that we should note?
I think you covered it all pretty well. I just pulled up the table of contents here, so folks kind of, see the whole thing in front of them.
Yeah, if it's possible, just flash to the photo essays, would you, for just the.
Oh, sure. Yes. Yeah.
This is a sort of moment to try to let you, watching the fences.
So Ryan took all these photos himself and then provided us with a sort of stream of consciousness account about his presence at the protests that accompanied these photos. And that was extremely cool.
Yeah, yes. And then Wen Guan also took photos at at the same time. And she's provided us a very nice discussion about the sociology of place and social change and the sociology of place, and with a focus on Black Lives Matter Plaza. So it's a very Washington D.C. issue, and we're feeling
Here we
very
go.
good about it.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, this is one. Yeah. And it's really got some, as you can see here, it's got some beautiful photos. I think we just feel very, very good about it, and I'm awfully proud of the student work. It's just excellent. I think it's an issue that I hope launches us in a really good direction, and that we will be able to get students from more universities participating with us. So, yeah, I think thank you very much. I didn't mean to go on so long. 12 months. Why shouldn't I go on?
This is great. I think, like you said, Jill, this will really launch the sociologist. I think you've done a wonderful job. So we're all looking forward to reading it. Thank you so much, Jill. Thank you so much, Patrick. So we will come to the conclusion of this awards ceremony. Thank you so much. I just want to say one more thing. Wanted to recognize the members of DCSS. DCSS. Yeah, it's here somewhere. Okay, so I want to say a big thank you to DCSS Executive Committee, which includes Katie Kerstetter, John Curtis, Jill Brantley, Sally Hilsman, Carl Schmidt, Howard Ames, Kathleen Gabriel, Michelle Kelso, Amaka Okechukwu, Brittany Gatewood, Jaquan Epps, Alexandra Rodriguez, and Eli Pine. Thank you all for all the work you do, and thank you for making DCSS vibrant. And thank you again to Robby Jones, and also congratulations to Lan for the award. Thank you all.
Lovely.